and then
Awesome.
unless
And then
any
we'll do that.
questions today, I'll be happy to go over it.
Nobody? I finished it again last night and I was like, oh,
No, it's so good.
I know, it really is. Has anybody finished it? Not yet? No. That's all right. Take your time. It's good. So many good examples of like all the things we've been talking about with like with all the stuff and even a little bit more today. Good. Very good. All right, guys. Well, I wanted to go ahead and get started by going over with you. I don't know if you guys noticed, but I released your scores to you for the 1 second, let me just pull it up, for the primary source analysis that you guys did. Okay, so can you guys all see that here? Almost, it's loading. Yeah?
Mm-mm.
No, not yet. Okay, now you guys can see it. Okay, cool. So you guys had these returned to you. Thank you guys for reading them, turning them in. I had almost everyone's. If you didn't turn it in yet, you're going to want to do that for at least some credit, okay? But a few things I just wanted to point out to you guys. Most of you were able to get down from Joseph Stalin's speech. So his speech was to a group of industrial workers. This was in 1931. So this is when he's kind of starting to take control of the economy. The Depression has happened, right? And so things are pretty bad. But at the beginning of the speech, he slights a slogan where he basically says, in the past, they used to say, we should let the people who are running the factories and whatever still keep running them and train the communists to take over. And most of you guys were able to get that right. What he's saying is that's wrong. The time has come now for the communists to take over. If you guys remember Lenin, when he came to power, he didn't immediately create a command economy because the Russian economy was so low and was not doing very well. Stalin is basically saying that idea, he doesn't say it directly, but he's like, that idea of Lenin's was not accurate. We need to switch now, or it's not the time for that anymore. So that's really important to keep in mind. Again, most of you are able to get the jungle law of capitalism, that the strong are right and the weak are wrong. But most people couldn't get the Mother Russia fatherland metaphor. You guys were right. There's some aspect of like nationalism with that because you look at your nation like a parent and then you love it like a parent. But Mother Russia, he refers to in the past, which would have been like under the Romanovs when they were like undeveloped, not modernized, not, moving forward, kind of like stuck in the old ways. Fatherland, if you notice, he refers to when he's talking about the communist state that they've formed. So notice there's this shift from like, and actually somebody, I can't remember who, but somebody said it so well. They were like, yeah, the mother was like this weaker form and this father was the stronger form, kind of had like a little bit of like kind of gender stereotypes in there too, which is totally correct. So he's kind of trying to contrast, like you should still love Russia as a parent, but the Russia from before was kind of weaker. And the Russia now we're trying to make it stronger. Okay. And then how does he attempt to motivate them? Not very many people got this at all. At the end, he quotes Lenin. And I want you to think about that. In a speech today, let's say the president or a politician quotes George Washington, right? Or Thomas Jefferson, some of these like a founding father. That is going to inspire nationalism in you. It's going to make their message seem credible, right? Because it's like, well, if they agree with Lenin or, oh, they agree with George Washington, like he can't be wrong. So it is trying to motivate them by saying like, we need to be better, but it's kind of trying to bring up this nationalism. Like, look at what Lenin started. We're going to keep building it. So just kind of look those over so you have a general idea of what I was getting at. And then as far as the peasants of Hunan, which was from his book, he's directing this actually towards Chinese revolutionaries specifically, not necessarily the peasants who might not even be able to read. And he's saying that the erroneous measures they're taking is not including the peasants in the revolt. And they're erroneous because if you remember, I think he said 100 million peasants or something. In the country, I don't think that's too many, but I can't remember the exact number he says in the speech. But basically, there's this huge force of peasants that we haven't even tapped into. That's a problem. So he's not trying to necessarily convince the peasants to join. He's trying to convince the revolutionaries who, if you guys remember the May 4th movement, most of the revolutionaries at that time were intellectuals, right? They were learned people. They were probably living in the city. They were maybe a little bit more educated and like sophisticated. And Mao is basically saying to them, stop being so pretentious. You need to turn to the peasants, okay? Like they're really a revolutionary force. And he advocates leading them because he thinks, and this was the main difference that most of you, I'm looking at your quizzes, have been able to get. Mao believes the revolution should start in the rural areas of China, whereas Lenin specifically thought it should be in the cities, right, with the factory workers and the unions. So I just wanted to go over those kind of briefly. Does anybody have any questions about those? About those sources? Or I put comments on everybody, so you should be able to look back at those. Okay. Very good though. Good job with the primary sources. So if you guys want to grab out your notes, red pens, highlighters, all that good stuff, we're just going to briefly go over what you guys finished taking notes on and then actually start into the next section. Hopefully we'll be able to get a lot of it done like we did yesterday. So you'll only have a few guided notes to do. But this is where we're actually talking about fascism. So we left off talking about the Great Depression, which, remember, it had we already did this slide, but it had a very global impact because the world was kind of dependent on the American economy at this point. And we left off right here. If you look, these are just some graphs from Great Britain, Germany, and the United States on the left. Look at their employment rate. They say 1932 was actually the worst year of the Depression when you study American history, 32 to 33, which unfortunately for the president at the time, that was an election year, which is why he's voted out of office. And then on the right, if you guys see, remember, world trade goes down significantly. Why? Anyone remember? What's that? Yeah, I heard it. Yeah. Tariffs. Good. They put tariffs on, which again are to put taxes on imports so people don't buy imports. So then, world trade just basically goes down. And then unfortunately, they put taxes on your imports, so your exports are going to go down. So it's kind of this like vicious cycle. So this is where you guys kept reading. Various nations responded to the Great Depression, and there's one of two ways. What were the two ways nations responded to the Depression and kind of the economic crisis at the time?
They either brought in a dictator or like an absolute leader, or they tried to like turn back to democracy.
Awesome. Perfect. That's exactly right. You have this one camp that turns to totalitarian kind of dictators or rulers who have absolute control. And then you have this other side that are like, we're going to try to maintain a democracy, right? Remember, a lot of European nations were newly democratic, okay? So it was a struggle. So for example, Britain and France specifically always had a monarchy. They're turning towards these more democratic forms. So Britain and France both took steps to improve the economy. They tried to avoid political extremes. Both of them formed a coalition government, which your book says is where multiple political parties get together and say, we'll work together in order to get stuff done. This does not happen in the United States, really, because we only have two political parties that really dominate. But in other countries where they have like 15, that's what you need to do. And both Britain and France were able to preserve democracy. Scandinavia, which is considered the countries of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, became more socialist. And to this day, they're actually democratic socialists, which is basically where the government invests very, very heavily in the economy. Stuff is still private, but they just have very heavy government involvement. And so they were able to preserve democracy. And then just a little U.S. history that your book touches on. The U.S. in that year, I told you in 1932, they end up electing Franklin Roosevelt, and he begins what's known as the New Deal. And he was able to preserve democratic government. You don't need to know the details of the New Deal. When you take APADS, you will memorize all of them. Oh my gosh, there's so many programs that he does that are really interesting. But he is basically the president who said, we have nothing to fear but fear itself when he's being inaugurated as president. So the Depression confronted democracies with serious challenge to their economic and political systems because, as I told you guys, the economy is the number one driving factor really behind political power, okay? If your economy is not doing well, people are probably going to vote you out of office, which is why presidents spend so much time focusing on that, or leaders spend so much time focusing on it. Now, unfortunately, some nations did not preserve their democratic governments. Does anyone remember a couple of them that your book mentions?
Spain.
Good. Spain's going to fall. Good. They set up a republic for a little bit, but then it just, goes downhill. Anybody else? A lot of the who remembers some of the new countries that were formed out of like Austria-Hungary, the Empire of Austria-Hungary, and like the Ottoman Empire?
Yugoslavia.
Good. So you have Yugoslavia, which is another one that turns to it. So, oh crap, did I skip that slide? Oh, I must not have put it on there. Well, Yugoslavia falls to it. Certain areas of Hungary fall to it, or Hungary falls to it, sorry. But they were not able to preserve their democracies. And a lot of them actually turned to, and this I think is new for you guys, fascism. Okay. So I'm not sure. Does anybody know what number we are on the guided notes at this point?
24.
Thank you. Perfect. Did you guys take notes on that last night? I think it.
Mhm.
Yes. Okay. You're up through 25. So remember, fascism is, if you look at the left, this is kind of why, if I ask you, why was fascism able to rise? A lot of people lost faith in democracy because they were frustrated by not only the Treaty of Versailles, but the Great Depression. And they were really like, when people are destitute, when people don't have money, things can get really bad. So they turn to extreme ideas like fascism. Now, fascism on the political spectrum, who remembers, is on the left or the right?
Far right.
Far right, the farthest right you can go. Good. So it's kind of, if you want to look at it, it's the opposite of fascism, or of communism, sorry, in theory. Basically, it's this new political militant movement, which means it glorifies the military, emphasizes loyalty to the state, obedience to the leader. The leader promises, and it's actually really interesting, you're going to see almost every fascist leader calls himself the leader. For those of you who've read far enough in the book, I don't want to give it away. This doesn't really give anything away, but they start to call Napoleon the leader. Okay. But this leader promises basically to bring order. They preach an extreme form of nationalism. And almost always, you're going to see this with Hitler. You're going to see this with Mussolini. You're going to see this with Franco. They wear uniforms, right? A lot of times military uniforms, even if they're not in the military, like Mussolini was not in the military. They wear military uniforms. They have these ceremonies, right, to kind of like glorify the nation, mass rallies. Again, you're going to see this happen in Animal Farm. So the lines are kind of blurred between the political ideology there. And they basically say that nations have to struggle. It's not, so I don't want you to think like, oh, who developed fascism? Fascism is not like a theory that was written down like Marx. It is basically, it happens, right? It rises out of things like this. And this is the first time this is going to happen. You guys are going to see. Okay, so you guys make sure you know just like we talked about fascism, communism, or totalitarianism and communism. Make sure you know kind of the things. The main things you want to think about with fascism that make it different is this extreme nationalism and this extreme, like this glorification of the military. Okay, a lot of like even today, like white supremacist groups in the United States would be considered fascist groups, right? Because of those two things, this extreme nationalism and this kind of glorification of military strength. Okay. Now, how your book pointed out, are fascism and communism actually similar to each other? It's okay. I know it's awkward to talk sometimes. So on the left are the things they have in common. Okay. So in common, they're both usually ruled by a dictator. Well, they are ruled by a dictator who only allows their political party to be in power. You're going to see this in Spain, right? The Falange was the political power that Franco was behind. And it's the only one that exists in Spain for over 50 years. Okay. They denied political or individual rights to the people, no democracy, and they declare the state supreme. So what does that mean when you say the state is supreme?
Like they have all the power?
Good. They have all the power, and the people, since it's ultranationalistic, should be basically willing to give their life for the state, right, for this nation. If you guys look here at the bottom, there's kind of the spectrum that we've done at the beginning of the school year. And you can see that communism is on the far left, fascism on the far right. If you guys remember, I told you that's actually, imagine it's three-dimensional and it's actually a circle. So fascism and communism actually meet in the back and become the same thing, which is basically slavery to a dictator. Okay. These are the two main differences that you should really keep in mind. Fascists, unlike communists, did not claim that there were no classes. So remember, Marx's idea was there should be no social classes. All of us are equal. We overthrow, the bourgeoisie. Fascists, on the other hand, were like, no, there are classes. There's an upper class, a middle class, and a lower class. And every class has its place in society, right? The workers are made and live to work. The middle class maybe runs the factories, and the upper class are the leaders. Okay, so they were very much pro social class. Notice that there are aristocrats, industrialists, war veterans, lower middle class people in the parties. Fascists were inherently nationalistic, whereas communists are international. Because communists, if you remember Marx's idea, said the whole world basically needs to overthrow this upper class. We need, and you're going to see this we saw this kind of when we looked at Russia, but that the revolution should spread to other countries, which again, after World War II, the United States enters into the Cold War because they're so afraid that the communists are trying to spread their revolution, the communist revolution, to other countries, because that's what communism says. Every other countries need to have this communist revolution. Fascists kind of just thought about themselves and their own national power. Now, why do fascists want to expand out of their own nation though? Because they want to build an empire. Okay, so notice the difference. One wants to have this quote class revolution. The other one wants to build an empire. Could be considered kind of the same thing, but they use different words. Okay, so hopefully you guys have these down from your reading, and that is the image from your book that kind of just gives a summary of it. Okay, so we're going to see that right now 3 really political leaders rise up who are considered fascist. And does anybody know what country fascism first rises to political power in?
Italy.
Mm-hmm. Good. It's not Germany. It actually starts in Italy. With a guy named Benito Mussolini, which there's a picture, again, notice wearing military stuff. Now, all of this, and I want you guys to keep this in mind, all of this is able to happen in the world because of the disappointment from the Treaty of Versailles and the Great Depression. Okay, so if the Great Depression hadn't happened, things might have been okay. But it was kind of one of those perfect storm situations where things just really went south, and so people turned to fascism. Sorry. So bitter disappointment over the Treaty of Versailles in Italy. Remember, they didn't get as much as they wanted, like Japan. The Depression is causing rising unemployment, widespread social unrest, and basically, remember, Europe does not have a history of democratic governments. So Italy's kind of like, this stinks. We don't really like this. This democracy is not everything the U.S. made it seem to be. So in 1919, if you notice, that's the same year that the Treaty of Versailles is signed. So they did not waste any time. The Fascist Party is founded. And Mussolini was actually a newspaper editor who would use his newspaper in order to publicly criticize the government. He had this kind of band of, I guess, hooligans, which they called themselves the black shirts, who would attack openly communist or socialist people in the streets. Okay. It's kind of like saying oh, I go to this school. It's like a common fact. It's just a thing about you. Well, you would be attacked for proclaiming that. He played on the fear of a workers' revolt. So he basically said, oh, look at the communists. They want to lead a worldwide workers' revolution. And he freaked people out. And so by doing that, the middle class, the aristocracy, the industrial leaders turned to him because they were afraid of the workers, basically. Notice on the left, it kind of tells you the things that he promised. I'll build up the economy. I'll build up the military. I'll be a good leader. So 3 years later, if you guys look there, a group of 30,000 fascists with him at the head marched on Rome, where the king at the time, they had a constitutional monarchy, the king at the time was basically said to him, we want Mussolini to be in charge now, or we're going to basically lead a violent uprising. And so the king's like, okay. And so he basically says that he took power legally because the king appointed him. Obviously, they were not blackmailing, but they were threatening the king and saying that they were going to have like this violent revolution if they didn't put him in place. And so Mussolini takes power, boom, legally. And he is the first fascist leader. Okay. If you look here, some of the things that he starts to do initially, this is him on the left right here. I don't know if you can see my arrow, but he's right here in the middle. Okay. He, as I told you guys, they're all going to have a name for themselves. Il Duce, which is the leader. He never is going to achieve the total totalitarian control that Stalin and Hitler have, but he does successfully abolish the democracy that they have in Italy, outlaw all political parties, use a secret police, use government censors and propaganda. These are all the things that you guys already know about totalitarian leaders and fascist leaders, right? Uses propaganda. Notice, and this is always what they're going to do, use the radio stations to basically just, it's kind of almost like in 1984. The radio and the TV are just constantly spewing all of the good things about the fascist people or the party in power. Outlawed worker strikes, because remember, they were afraid of a workers' uprising. And he tries to build his own form of a command economy, which was basically the government allies with the industrialists and large landowners for the benefit of the wealthy people. Okay. How can we make the most money? They're not really concerned about the workers' wages, working conditions. No. Just how can we boost economic growth for the people already at the top of society. Okay. So that's kind of what happens in Italy. And this is through the 1920s and into the 30s. Okay. He holds power all the way up to World War II. So he's really kind of the start. Any questions about Italy, though? I feel like I went through that quickly, but I do have a video just for you, briefly. So Mussolini, if you see, oh crap, I think it's going to start. Mussolini was of modest height, as their book says. So he usually, if you guys look even where he's at, it looks like he's standing on something because his torso is not long enough to be that tall. But he would actually usually stand on something on the balcony and look over the people so that he seemed very like tall and great. And he was very emotional and kind of theatrical, which you're going to see as a theme throughout these leaders' kind of, style. He vows to lead Italy back to her ways of ancient greatness. What ancient greatness would he be referring to in these speeches?
The Romans?
Yeah, going back to Rome, like Julius Caesar, which I kind of jokingly say it throughout, but that was kind of the last time that Italy was like an imperial power. They were always very economically, remember, they controlled a trade in the Renaissance. So economically, they're always strong, but not necessarily militarily. So he basically refers to Rome, and it's like, we should be like Rome. So I don't know if you guys are going to be able to hear this, but let's just see if you can. I just wanted you guys to listen to him for a second. Can you hear it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
L'onore e il privilegio di ospitare nel vostro mare le forze navali dell'Italia fascista. Questo è un privilegio che vi impone dei particolari doveri. Noi fummo grandi quando dominammo il mare.
Okay. So we don't have to watch too much of that, but I just wanted you guys to kind of see his like sort of dramatic gestures, how he pauses when he's talking, So a lot of times these leaders rise to power because they are very compelling, right? And people like to listen to them or at least watch them speak. And that's how you get people, behind you. Okay. So how is fascism going to rise to power then in Germany? Anybody have any ideas?
With Hitler and the Nazis.
Good. The Hitler and the Nazis. So they formed the Nazi party. Is it going to rise to power as quickly as it does in Italy?
No.
No, so actually, and this is important to note, fascism doesn't take control in Germany until really the Great Depression. So notice Mussolini takes power in 1922. That's like almost 10 years before the Depression hits. So they're much earlier. Germany is going to be fairly stable. Remember, you have the Weimar Republic, you have the Dawes Plan, which was the loans from the United States. So Germany is kind of trying to get its stuff together. So Hitler is this, as you guys know, on the left, 1919. So the same time the Fascist Party is forming in Italy, he joins a tiny right-wing political group that calls itself the National Socialist German Workers' Party, shortened to Nazism. Okay, so and this is important. Nazism is the German brand of fascism. Okay, so it's not separate from fascism; it's just the German form of it. So they basically were very upset again by the Treaty of Versailles and the fact that Germany had to kind of take on the war guilt clause, reparations, losing their colonies, etc. And they also were kind of driven to fight communism. So they saw what happened in the Soviet Union and they said, we don't want that to happen here, which is ironic because they call themselves the Workers' Party, but they're inherently anti-communist. So there's a lot of contradictions. They adopt the swastika, which is their hooked cross as their symbol, and their private militia are called the brown shirts. So remember, in Italy, it's the black shirts. Here, it's the brown shirts. And they're basically, a private militia basically is like an illegal army that someone has that's separate from the government army. Remember, Germany at this time was not allowed to have a military, which is another reason why them setting up this militia was illegal. The thing about Hitler is, for a long time, he was kind of like not well known. He does receive medals of bravery in World War I, but he doesn't really come into himself until he goes to Munich and joins the Nazi Party. Okay, and the Nazi Party is going to rise to power because in 1923, so a year after what happens with Mussolini, the Nazis plot to seize power in Munich. Just like they look at Mussolini, they're like, he just led a force of 30,000 fascists onto the capital and they gave him power. We need to do that. Well, they try to do that and they fail. Okay. And Hitler is arrested because he's a ringleader, tried for treason and sentenced to 5 years in prison. He only ends up he serves less than a year. I think he serves like 9 months. So he doesn't serve that long, but basically nobody was taking him seriously. Okay. While he's in jail, and I'm sure you guys already know a lot of this, he wrote a book called Mein Kampf, which means my struggle. If you ever try to read it, you'll see how full of contradictions it is. Like I just told you, like the Nazi Party is the German Worker Party, but they're anti-communist. It doesn't make a lot of sense, actually. So it basically, though, you should know what it says. So these are kind of all of the words that you guys have already probably studied in grade school, but basically saying he was mistaken in saying this, that they were Aryans or this master race of people, which was not true. That was not their ethnicity. He declares non-Aryan races, Jews, Slavs, and Gypsies. So Slavs, remember, are like Eastern European. He called the Treaty of Versailles an outrage, and he says Germany needs to take back that land. He says Germany is overcrowded and needs more living space, which in German is Lebensraum. And so he says in his book, we should conquer Eastern Europe and Russia. Okay, so he's already laying out basically his plan, which one of the first things he does is invade Poland. And he does try to go after Russia. But he says we need to basically make Germany into an imperial power, which goes right along with the principles of fascism. And he writes that. He's let out in 1923, 1924. But when the Depression hits 5 years later, that's when people turn to Hitler. Okay? Again, if the Depression hadn't happened, would someone like Hitler have risen to power? Potentially not. But basically, when people are economically scared, financially unstable, they want security and leadership. And he had constantly been promising that. Remember, he was also a very, very good speaker. If you look on the left, Der Führer, which is the German way to say the leader. So we have Il Duce in Italy. We have Der Führer in Germany with the Nazi Party. So everybody kind of has they make this idea that we're your leader. If you remember, Stalin did the same thing, right? He painted himself as this like savior of the Russian people, this father figure that they could trust in. and people want to trust their leader, right? Especially when they're scared. So again, he was a very compelling speaker. So look at him. Some of you maybe have seen, probably have seen videos of him giving a speech. For those of you who haven't, here's him giving, it's really short. It's only 27 seconds, but it kind of shows you his style.
Dass ich fleißig gewesen bin, dass ich gearbeitet habe, dass ich mich in diesen Jahren für dich eingesetzt habe, dass ich anständig meine Zeit verwendet habe im Dienste meines Volkes. Gibst du jetzt eine Stimme ab? Wenn ja, dann tritt für mich ein, so wie ich für dich eingetreten bin.
Okay, so what did you guys notice during his speech? Maybe even that made it different from Mussolini's.
He's very
It's very
intense.
loud.
Very intense. He's a lot louder. Yes. I think it's interesting. Like, I felt like Mussolini was very like calm. He had this like calming presence that was like very strong and self-assured. Whereas I feel like Hitler kind of encapsulates all of the rage that Germans feel, right? And their frustration. There also are cultural differences, right? Like every culture kind of expresses themselves differently. But he's very loud, yeah, and kind of, I would say, much more dramatic than Mussolini was. Anything else you guys noticed? I thought was interesting. I feel like his hair, he looks so sweaty and his hair is all messed up, probably because he gets too into it, you know? But yeah, so those are just the interesting things to keep in mind. But so how, does anybody know, how does he actually take power as a leader? Does he lead a coup d'etat? Does he march on the Capitol?
He legally, technically gains power.
He does he legally also takes power as a political leader. So again, these are not like people leading coup d'etat. You're going to see Franco in Spain actually does lead a coup d'etat, a rebellion. But Hitler and Mussolini take power legally, right? So the rest of the world is kind of like, okay, he's a nut job, but okay, you know. So basically, he becomes a chancellor, which is an appointed position. Okay, so the president at the time, Hindenburg, is kind of pressured by other political leaders to name Hitler the chancellor, because up till, okay, so look at 1932. I told you guys that was the worst year of the Depression. Nazis were the largest political party. People trusted them because they played on people's fear and they promised a solution. So they basically thought, the rest of the political leaders said, okay, it's Hitler. Again, I told you, people kind of thought he was a whack job. So they're like, we'll control him and use him to calm the masses. But they were wrong, okay, because he was not controllable. So the president legally names Hitler chancellor, and he comes to power legally, just like, not just, but similar to how Mussolini did in 1933. Now, as soon as he becomes chancellor, he calls for brand new elections. And why would he do that? Because he wants to vote out all of those political leaders who appointed him, who are not Nazis. Okay, so now that he's in power, he's basically going to try to sway the people voting so that he can have a majority in parliament, similar to having a majority in Congress. Okay, so that does not happen. That's never happened in the United States, where you just randomly say, okay, we're going to have brand new elections to re-elect representatives. But they did. And interestingly enough, 6 days before the election is supposed to take place, a fire destroys the Reichstag, which is the parliament building that they met in. So that's like somebody set fire to the Capitol. And the Nazi Party, with Hitler at the lead, who's now a legal government representative, said that the communists were behind it. And by creating that chaos and fear in the people, the Nazis and their allies won a majority in parliament. Okay, so notice how he kind of very Bismarckian manufactures incidents, right? Remember how Bismarck, that was his thing. He would manufacture incidences in order to get his way. That's what Hitler did. Okay, so he and the Nazis gain a majority. Now you might be thinking, well, the other political parties weren't necessarily communist. No, but any political party at that time that was left-leaning, you even see it happen today in politics. Anybody that's left-leaning is called a communist, okay, or is called a socialist. And so they basically said it was them. And they said, oh, those political leaders are tied to them. You shouldn't vote for them. So he wins a majority, and he quickly turned Germany into a totalitarian state, which, remember the definition from your quiz yesterday, controls all aspects of public and private life. So just like Mussolini had done, and actually just like Stalin did, banned all other political parties, had his opponents arrested, creates a secret police. Notice here we have the SS. So the SS and the Gestapo are both secret police. The Gestapo was like the secret police that would spy on people. The SS was kind of like the militia or the army that protected the Nazis. So they're the ones who go out and murder Hitler's enemies or potential threats. The Gestapo are the ones who are collecting information on people who might potentially be treasonous. Okay, so basically they were saying to Germans, you need to be totally obedient to us. Don't even think about, treason or rebellion or plotting, to set up a different type of government. They also create a command economy because we're in the middle of the Depression at this point and people are stressed out about jobs and money. He bans worker strikes, dissolves labor unions, gives government authority over business and labor. These are all very anti-communist policies, right? This is the opposite of what communists would want. And he puts millions of Germans to work. And so the Germans tended to trust him because he delivered on what he said, right? They constructed factories, they built highways, they manufactured weapons, they served in the military, which if you remember, Germany is not really supposed to have a military at this time. So you can see that Hitler's already violating the conditions of the Treaty of Versailles. But people start to trust him because he's able to give them jobs, okay? And it makes them feel secure. Any questions about this page? Is it okay if I go on? And so he becomes this supreme leader. If you look on the left, these are some propaganda posters that you see the boy and the girl at the top, Aryan race, blonde hair, blue eyes. Hitler, who is not blonde hair or blue eyes, that was what he considered, remember though, the Aryan race. He's down in the bottom. Notice he has this savior mentality, right? Look, doing all for Deutschland, which is Germany, and he's kind of like leading the charge. It kind of looks like the image from the French Revolution of the woman carrying the flag, right, as they revolt. So this very much like nationalistic fighting symbol. So Germany is going to try to shape public opinion. So this is where he takes control of the press, the radio, paintings, film, everything becomes propaganda. Books that don't conform to the Nazi beliefs are burned in bonfires. And I don't want to give anything away, but the next book we're going to read is called The Book Thief. And it's about a little girl in Germany. And there is a scene, she's called The Book Thief because any books that were not part of Nazism were burned in these huge bonfires in the middle of the city of towns. And she would see one in her town because she was a little German girl. And so that's kind of actually the plot, or like, I guess the main point of the book. It starts like that, was her trying to keep these books from being burned. So that's what Hitler did, though. And the book captures that. So we're going to read that next. If you want to get it over spring break, hint, hint, you can start to read it if you're bored. Churches were forbidden to criticize the Nazis or the government at the time. So Nazism is not atheist. Fascism is not atheist. A lot of times, actually, the church, the state church, allies itself with the government. So the church kind of becomes this tool of the government to control people. So the churches, again, had to conform to being like these tools of the government in Germany. Children joined the Hitler Youth, or the League of German Girls. Remember, there was something similar in communist Soviet Union. We saw this in 1984, okay? And they convinced people that continuous struggle brought victory in the long run, which, again, Animal Farm, you're going to see this. I was reading it because I was reading it last night. They say that the whole time to the animals, right? We have to have this continuous struggle in order to have victory, in order to get. So this is something that both sides of the political spectrum are constantly telling their followers. So we've seen this in Animal Farm. We've seen this in the Soviet Union. Remember that you need to struggle and sacrifice for the good of the nation. It's a common kind of thing. When people are struggling and are unhappy, you can convince them that their struggle is worthy of something. And that kind of keeps them going, which is what they did. Okay. And the very last part of this thing that we're going to go over is most of the time they have fascists, and totalitarian leaders have scapegoats, remember? And so we talked about in the Ottoman Empire, it was the Armenians. In Russia, it was basically any religious group. The kulaks, which were the peasant, the wealthier peasants in Russia, if you remember. In Hitler, it's the Jewish. In Hitler's Germany, it's the Jewish people. Who is it that is the scapegoat for everything in Animal Farm?
Mr. Jones.
Yeah, Mr. Jones. And
Snowball.
then it becomes Snowball, right? Snowball's the one who's doing everything that's wrong. So you guys will get to that. But most of you should actually probably already be there. But anti-Semitism is a really important term to know. A Semite is someone who is of Jewish I don't know the word in English. I guess inheritance. So if you're anti-Semite, it's where you're against Jewish people. And that's just a key part of Nazi ideology. Jewish people were less than 1% of the German population. They were not by any means this like large minority that was going to potentially take over. Not at all. But they had to find a scapegoat. And Germany found a lot of things to blame on them. The other thing you need to keep in mind is that the Jewish people at the time were some of the only people, they were bankers and financiers, because historically, I'm going like way far back in history, people looked at working with money as kind of like dirty and low. And since Jewish people were often discriminated in the places they lived, the only jobs that they could get were the ones who worked with money, and they were really good at it. And they became the bankers and the leaders of financial institutions. And so they ended up gaining a lot of wealth and prominence in those roles. And so as a result, a lot of people, and you can read about it, claim that Hitler was jealous, right, of like the Jews' wealth, of their prominence, of their success, of their, whatever. And so he turns against them and uses them as scapegoats for Germany's troubles. Since the World War I, he basically says in World War I, they were even against us. Okay. So in 1933, he's just come to power. He doesn't waste any time. He passes all these laws that deprive Jews of their rights. And one of the things that happens is that violence against the Jewish people increase. Do you remember what that's called? Where there's organized violence against Jewish people?
Anti-Semitism.
That's like the ideology. What's the actual, like the idea? What's the actual like thing where you lead organized violence against Jews?
Isn't it called a pogrom?
Pogrom. Pogrom, very good, with an R. Pogrom. So violent, yeah, exactly. A pogrom is when you organize attacks against Jewish people. So in some of the laws that deprived them of their rights was that they had to wear the yellow Jewish star that identified them always as a Jewish person. They were allowed to be refused great service in certain areas. It all starts like it's very, very slow, and it pretty much ends pre-World War II with all of the Jews being in ghettos. Remember, they're forced to live in segregated areas of the city. So in 1938, this is an interesting thing. Not interesting, sorry. This is a very, very sad but important event. Nazi mobs basically attacked the Jewish people in their homes and on the streets. They destroyed thousands of Jewish-owned buildings. They threw rocks at them, and they set them on fire. And it's called Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. And it basically is the start. This was in 1938. So notice this is 5 years after Hitler takes power, only 1 year before the start of World War I or World War II. But it's really the real start of the process of eliminating Jewish people from Germany. And it starts with this night. So, right, the night, Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. And it was kind of, if you look at this picture, the primary source photo of a day or a week after. What do you guys notice about the photo that's interesting or stands out to you?
You can kind of see a couple of people laughing and like a guy looking at the actual store.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So, and I thought you guys would notice first, like, oh, the broken glass and the destroyed shops. But yeah, on the left, you see people walking and looking at it in this kind of curious way, right? They don't look horrified. They don't look saddened or like, oh my gosh, that's horrible. Like, I feel like if we walked by that, knowing something had happened, like we walked by, I don't know, downtown Akron and known that something like that happened, we would be horrified. We would be like, oh, this is so sad. But people are laughing. They're kind of just going on with their everyday life. Like, it's not a big deal because there was this is where you have this developed indifference. And Hitler did it over 5 years, right? It's like the 2 minutes hate in 1984. Constantly, every day, by controlling the newspapers, by controlling the radio, you're turning people's minds against this group of people. Okay. It's very subtle, but over time, it starts to sink in and you lose any empathy or understanding or respect that you have for that group of people. All right. If you allow yourself to listen to that kind of stuff, which is basically what happened in a lot of Germans' minds and to a lot of German people. Not all of them. Obviously, there are a lot of people who fought against it, but it's this kind of desensitization, and you start to believe like maybe they really are inferior or less, or the cause of all of our problems. So yeah, that really stood out to me, that those images on the left. Some people are looking at it like, oh my gosh. Some people are walking by it like, got to get to work. But so it's very mixed results. So that was kind of the start. So by the mid 1930s, we have two antagonistic or conflicting camps in Europe. And this is all setting the stage for World War II. Okay. On the one side, we have people who are still pro-democracy. By people, I mean nations. And on the other side, we have countries that have turned to totalitarian leaders for security and order. Okay. So this is Europe at the time. Notice we have newly formed Yugoslavia down there. Austria and Hungary are separated. Poland's on there. So a lot of countries in Eastern Europe are brand new countries. They have always been under an empire, under a leader, and they establish democracies that quickly fall to dictators because they don't know how to lead a government, right? They have never been independent. Okay, that's why you heard a lot of European leaders during the age of imperialism say things like, we're preparing them to lead on their own, because they, and there was obviously an excuse, but that kind of was what happened in Europe. They didn't ever have anybody teach them how to be leaders. So all of these areas turn to a dictator of some sort. They suspend their constitutions. Czechoslovakia is the only one in Eastern Europe that's still a democracy by the mid-30s. And they have no democratic experience and severe economic problems. So people turn to dictatorship for stability. I told you this is how somebody like Napoleon rises to power, right? The French people were so sick of the revolution and of fighting and of conflicts. So they're like, please bring us stability. So they put someone like Napoleon in power, right? It happens over and over throughout history. So only nations with slight democratic traditions were able to keep their democracy. So that's Britain, France, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. Everywhere else has fallen. Okay. So I know that went a little bit long, but I think we should be up through most of your guys' notes that you need to. On the Google Classroom, we just said to go through number 32, and tomorrow we'll finish the notes together. You will have an assignment tomorrow, a cause and effect assignment. And then I know it's really fast, but we are just I'm not going to give you a test over this unit, but I'm going to give you a Google form quiz on Thursday over the rest of the notes. So I'll have your first quiz graded and back to you, but no test, just want to do 2 quick quizzes. And then Thursday, Ms. Dana Miller and I are going to present to you what your assignment will be over spring break. Okay. And then we'll be available Friday for any questions during office hours. So does anybody have any questions on the stuff we just kind of went through? I know it was a lot and fast, but.
Can we go back to the economic reforms and secret police for the Germans?
This one? No.
Yes, thank you.
That's one. Okay. Yeah. Okay, good. Yes, no problem. This is in your guys' chapter 15 PDF. If you want to just go back and skim it, if you want to, I don't know. I would definitely skim it maybe before you take the quiz on Thursday, just because I think that'll go into your head a little bit better. But it'll be over just these sections. We just have one other small part to cover. Any other questions about what's going on this week or what we need to do? Okay, well, we have our live session tomorrow as well, where we'll finish the notes and talk about Animal Farm. So keep reading it. It's really good. You guys are going to see there's a lot of twists and turns. And then again, on Thursday, there'll be the small quiz and the introduction to your next, I guess, your spring break assignment. Okay. All right. If you guys don't have any questions, you can sign off. If you want to stay and ask us questions just one-on-one, feel free to. But thank you guys all for coming, and we'll see you tomorrow. Have a good
Bye,
day.
guys. See you tomorrow.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye. I'm going to stop presenting. Yeah, I still gotta stop recording. Uh-oh, Andrew left the room.